welcome back to another episode of Junkyard Junior, folks. So you remember my buddy Kevin's airboat that we worked on in a previous video? Well, we got some more work to do to it. Yes, the fuel pump is still working, no failures there. But remember that alternator that was squeaking like a mug? It's time to get that thing replaced. Remember, it was sitting a little bit crooked due to the bracket not being rigid enough, and that serpentine belt was just squealing terribly. So we got a new setup from Jones, and several of the things that I like about Jones: one, made in USA. Two, just a simple quality product that we need. We don't need to have a lot of fancy bells and whistles, even though I do think this is fancy bells and whistles, but we just need something that works, reliable, nice and sturdy. Get this stuff opened up here, it's the real deal. No Chinese garbage here. So they actually come with a master disconnect as well. So the boat does already have one of these, so this is not exactly necessary for our application, but an extra part that they include. So if you don't have one, there you go, it comes with it. We did get 2 belts in this kit, and here's just another simple thing that I really like about Jones. So one of the unique things is these belts use a radius tooth design, so there's no slippage or squeakage at all. Only problem is you can't get these at your local parts store, so that's why we get 2. There's going to be 1 in the front box of this boat, so if Kevin ever needs a spare, there it is. And if you ever need a replacement, how about that? Phone number, name of the company, and the part number right on the belt. You can't mess that up. So there's that. Then on the crankshaft, since we are working on small block Chevy, normally you have a pulley that bolts directly to the harmonic balancer on the traditional 3-bolt pattern for small block Chevy, and it stands off a little ways, and then it has the pulleys for the belt. Well, Jones does it a little bit different because the alternator is going to be set forward in front of the engine. So instead of having that pulley that bolts directly to the crankshaft with these 3 bolts, they have this assembly. So it's kind of like a really short mandrel, if you will. So these 3 bolts go on the harmonic balancer, and then this one goes directly into the crankshaft. So then we've got our nice radius tooth belt pulley here, and got 2 guides on it. So when that belt goes down on there, it can't walk off either way. Now, if we had to, if Jones didn't actually know what they were doing, but they do, and they send you the right stuff the first time, and depending on the setup, they make these a lot longer. So you can move this forward and back. Say you're running an alternator on one side, a fuel pump on the other, a dry sump pump, all those sort of accessories, they've got you dialed in on that stuff and can hook you up with exactly what you need. So we get down to the business end, the alternator. Here she is. So on a small block Chevy, you have these 2 bolts here, which are like your power steering pump bolt holes, is what would have been on the block there from the factory. That's the 2 bolt holes that we're going to use to hold this assembly onto the block. So there's your alternator and bracket assembly. When these 2 are bolted up, then the alternator pivots just like that. So that's going to give you your belt adjustment, and you don't want to run these real tight, so it's not like you need a pry stick on it or anything. Then we've got our charging post here directly to the battery, or the disconnect switch I should say. And another thing, they put this little tag on here for a reason. Most people ignore it. It says ground strap. It must be important if they put it on there, right? Yes, because Jones does not want you to rely on these 2 bolts tightening down on these brackets to create a ground. They want the alternator itself to have a solid ground on it, so we will be hooking that up. We're not going to ignore it like most people do when you throw away the instructions. So let's get started. Let's get the old junk ripped off of here and start working on some real parts and get this thing dialed in. So looking at Kevin's bracket here, let me pull these lines out of the way for you. I think we actually found the source of the real problem. You can grab this alternator and watch this top bolt and bracket situation here. It completely flexes because this bolt hole is like completely broken out on the inside, so it's just complete garbage. So we're gonna grab some tools, get our charging wire off here, get these 2 Allen head bolts out, get our 3 crankshaft pulley bolts out, and the harmonic balancer bolt itself. Then we're ready to start installing some new quality components. So our first order of business is to get this drive mandrel installed onto the harmonic balancer. So we've got 3 countersunk Allen head screws and son of a gun. I'll be darned. They sent coarse thread bolts like a big block Chevy has instead of fine like a small block. I guess that's an honest mistake. We need these to be fine thread, not coarse thread. So I'm gonna have to call Jones and get the correct ones because the hardware store is already closed tonight, so that's not an option. So I'll get these guys to send us some. So that's one thing that does happen when you're dealing with this kind of stuff. Honest mistake, wrong bolt, somebody grabbed the wrong ones, no big deal. I have dealt with Jones for a long time though, and I can tell you that this is one of those situations where when they make an error like that, you know, and I've even screwed some of their stuff up in the past, but when little stuff like this happens, they stand behind it. They're such a great company. I'll call them tomorrow and they will have them in the mail, and I'll have them the following day. So little minor bump in the road, no big deal. Let's get some new bolts and we'll finish bolting all this stuff on. Well, you've heard me say it before, we're dealing with your local idiot here. Guess what happened to be in that bag of plastic that I ripped off of the mount earlier? The fine thread bolts that we need, along with a green apple Jolly Rancher. Jones always sends a Jolly Rancher with every part that goes out of their shop. So I'm an idiot. They sent the correct stuff. I didn't bother to look for it. I set it aside, didn't pay enough attention like I should have. Hey, it happens. I'm human. I could admit it. So let's get back to it of screwing the correct bolts into this harmonic balancer. Okay, so we got our 2 bolts going into the block here. Snug those up good and sturdy, and then the slider is down here on the bottom. So we actually had to take this bolt out to roll the alternator in just a little bit because the belt is a little bit on the short side. And it's not that it's too short, they just want that alternator as snug and close to the block and balancer as possible. You can swing it out a really long ways, you can tell by this adjuster here, but there's no sense in running a longer belt because you're just gonna get more belt slaps. So keep everything as snug as you possibly can. With that being said, remember I told you earlier that these belts do not run real tight. We've got a decent amount of slack here. It's not a V-belt, it's not a serpentine belt, it's a radius tooth belt. It doesn't have to be that tight. We're not relying on the friction of the rubber on the pulleys to keep this thing from squealing and slipping. It has teeth to do the job. So that's all you need right there. When everything heats up, it's actually gonna snug up just a little bit as the block and alternator bracket expand when they get some heat in them. So looks good. Now we can hook up our charge wire, but I was kind of eyeballing that, and I actually think that this charge wire is a little bit small. This is a 140 amp alternator instead of 100 that he had. So it is a pretty significant upgrade, and I'd rather have too big of a charge wire than too small. So I'm gonna trace this down and see if it goes over to the switch like it should. And if so, pull this wire out, make us a new one. It will be red because it's a charge wire. I don't want a black wire on a charge wire. It's too confusing that way. Then we can plug it directly onto the side of this alternator. Then we can come back here, try to sneak in here, and remember that ground strap. We're gonna put a wire from there, and we're probably just gonna go directly to this engine block. We'll clean up that area right there, or this motor mount bolt, either one, whichever is the easiest to get to, but we've gotta have that ground wire hooked up. Got us a fresh batch of supplies so we can finish off the wiring on this boat. One thing that the boat did have that I didn't like is just a small, maybe a number 10 wire going from the 2 positive posts on the battery. Even though it is going to cross over in the battery box, I still like to hook both positive posts on the battery together. So I made us a nice 2-gauge cable for that, so we know that's 100%. And looking at the chart for the battery charge cable wire size, due to the length versus the amperage on the alternator, we were right in between a 6 and an 8. So I said, you know what? You can't have too big of a charge wire. Let's go with a 6 gauge. And with that being said, on that ground post on the alternator, you want that to be at least the same size. So we went the 6 gauge ground wire for the alternator as well. So we're gonna get some ends crimped on there, get them cut down to length where we need them. And then we can pull this thing out, fire it up, and see if it's charging. Hopefully, see if we can make some progress. We're ground wire's hooked up, charge wire's hooked up. I just got to run it across through this rig in here and over to the battery disconnect switch, and we'll tie it up, you know, on the inside of the tube there, get it all nice and tidy so it's not flopping in the breeze, because that's not my style. So remember, we got our nice 6-gauge charge wire in here. Did the same thing with the ground wire. So the ground wire comes off the back of that post on the alternator, and you notice we got 2 ground wires right here. So I'm the guy that overkills grounds. Whenever you're working on a modern Holley EFI setup, ground can make you really chase your butt, and that was completely my fault that I had screwed that up on my truck. So learned my lesson, and I always put way too many grounds on things now. So it comes from the alternator to the cylinder head, got 2 wires in here, and one goes back to the block so that I know it's completely grounded. And on the other side, it goes from the block down to the battery, so we know we're good there. We've got some solid grounds, everything's connected together now, nothing to worry about there. Well, it's definitely charging. The belt's not squeaking, so we accomplished the 2 things we were out to do. The alternator is putting out what seems like a little bit. It's right at 17.5 volts. It's pretty stout. I know they do have an adjustable regulator on, so I'm going to call Jones tomorrow and make sure that they're okay with that on a 12-volt system, because they do make these for 12 and 16 volt. Kind of seems like we have a 16 volt, but whenever you bring the RPMs back down, we're right at that 14, 15 mark, which is kind of ideal for regular 12 volt stuff to be able to charge the system back up. So minor little detail there, I'll call them. One more quick little bit of information. So I did talk to Jones just a few minutes ago here at the shop today, and turns out that the alternator that was sent to us does have adjustable voltage on it. So we need it to be somewhere around 14.5 to 14.9 to properly charge a 12 volt system. This one's putting out about 18.5 to 18.9. So luckily, all we need is this little guy right here to get this alternator dialed in. It is a little bit of trial and error process, but trying to show you up in here, there's a tiny little screw right in there. That's where we can adjust the voltage. So we're going to give it a little turn, fire it up, and see how many volts we've got. Well, the alternator's charging and the belt's not squeaking. I guess we actually did something right. Thanks to Jones for having some killer made in USA products. Always support that made in USA product when you get the chance, folks. Sometimes you got to pay more, but it's always worth it. Remember, you're supporting a mom and pop shop when you do so. Let's keep this country alive and small businesses thriving. Thanks so much for watching Junk with Junior. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more episodes. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Give us a thumbs up, and we will see you next time.